I'm in love with this tablecloth. There was this incredible textile designer who had this store filled with shibori fabric she'd made at Portobello Markets. I wish I could have bought everything, but I was a broke fashion student at the time, so I just got this tablecloth. And I had pretty mixed feelings about chopping it up to make a circle skirt, but the skirt turned out so well. It's absolutely beautiful, and now I'm going to show you how to do it. Most people start pattern making because they want to make their own designs. Well, I did anyway. And I kind of feel if you don't actually know how to make your own clothes afterwards, what's the point in pattern making? And vice versa. Sewing your own clothes does take a while, especially if you're new to sewing, and it's so much more rewarding if it's your own ideas and if they fit you really well. So this is the first in a long line of videos I plan on doing on how to create your own basic patterns, so very beginner friendly, and then I'm going to show you how to make them. And it'll be designed for beginners, so each tutorial will focus on two main sort of sewing areas or techniques, I guess. For example, in this video, first I'm going to show you how to turn a tablecloth into a circle skirt, then I'll show you how to create a beautiful waistband and insert an invisible zip. I've been sewing since I was a kid, and I'm going to share some of the sewing tips I picked up when I was working for high-end designers in London, like Jenny Packham and Alexander McQueen, which were, the way they approach sewing is quite different from what I learnt at textiles and when I was studying fashion as well. So I'll share those tips with you, and I'm also going to share a little pattern making hack to make stitching in the ditch so much easier. Like all my videos, I go into a lot of detail, but that's so you can actually follow along and create your own patterns and sew them yourselves. But also timestamp each section, so if you're more comfortable with sewing or making your own patterns, you can skip to the sections you want. This skirt turned out so well, and it was actually really easy to make, so I actually started looking for more fabric ideas, so I'll share those sources with you at the end as well to get you inspired to start making your own skirts. But let's get started. So for this demo, I'm using a circular tablecloth to create my pattern, so the base of my pattern is a circle and the outer edge will be my hem. You could use a rectangular or square tablecloth though, but this will give you a jagged handkerchief style hem. The best thing about using a tablecloth is the hem is already finished for you, so that's one less thing to do, which is why it's such a great beginner-friendly sewing project. But we need to add an inner circle so we can put the skirt on our body, and the circumference of the inner circle, so the edge of the length here, needs to be the same length as the circumference of the part of the body we're going to put the skirt on. I'll be making this skirt in this demonstration to go around my waist, so the inner circle needs to be the same measurement as my full waist circumference, so the front and the back. The distance between the inner and outer circle is your skirt length. If you're using a tablecloth, you don't really have a choice about how long it is. It's kind of whatever's left over after you create your inner circle. So before you buy your tablecloth, fold it in half and hold it up to your body to check you're happy with the length. And if you want a bigger, longer skirt, you need to get a bigger tablecloth. There are a couple of different ways you can finish a skirt. You might have seen other circle skirt videos, people using an elastic band or creating a casing with an elastic in it. I'm going to cover this in a different video. In this video, I'm going to focus on doing a rectangular waistband and using an invisible zip. And to do that, I need to add a seam. So I'll need to cut into the tablecloth, and you can see the cut line here. Your cut line will need seam allowances. I use metric, so I'll add a 1 centimeter seam allowance on each side. If you're imperial, you'll add ½ inch on both sides. You don't need to mark the seam allowance on your pattern, but you do need to think about it and be aware of it and add it to your inner circle measurement. A lot of other circle videos I've seen have sort of skipped this step, I think because they want to make it look simple, but the reality is if you don't include the seam allowance, your skirt will end up being too small. I'm going to start the demonstration in a sec, but for now, remember the inner circle is your waist length plus the cut line seam allowances. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing to do is measure your waist. So you want to grab measuring tape and find the smallest part of your waist. Try and keep so I'll get my top out of the way, just go around, find the smallest part, try and keep the tape horizontal. People always say don't measure over clothes, but if you know you're always going to wear a top underneath your skirt, measure over your clothes. Don't let the rules define you if it makes sense for how you're going to wear the skirt. And now's when you want to think about ease too and how much extra sort of wiggle room you want. I like to put just sort of 2 things in here, just to give myself a bit of extra space. And if I do that and sort of take a breath out, I'm sort of about 73 centimeters. But just to demonstrate, if I sort of shimmy and breathe in a bit, I can get down to 68. So think about what's going to work best for you. I'm going to do 73 centimeters, even though I could get down to 68. So that's essentially a whole graded size. But I know I want to wear the skirt for have long boozy lunches with the girls and eat lots of bread and cheese and have a really good time. So think about what you're wearing it for and how you want to feel in it too. My inner circle circumference is my waist length, so 73 centimeters, plus seam allowances, which are 1 centimetre each, so 2 centimetres, which equals 75 centimetres. Okay, I've got my measurements, now we can start cutting the skirt. Remember to wash and iron your tablecloth first, just in case it hasn't been pre-washed because it might shrink. And a pro tip, don't wash on the day before you plan to make the skirt and forget to check the weather because it might rain all day. The easiest way to cut the skirt is to fold it in half and then half again, so you should have 4 layers. And I've got mine inside out just in case the chalk I use leaves a permanent mark. Also, when you fold your skirt, make sure the sides are on grain. To do this, you just need to have a really good look at your fabric and make sure the weave is going straight along the fold. Now I need to mark the inner circle, and to do that, I need to do a little bit of high school geometry to work out the radius of the inner circle. The radius equals the circle's circumference divided by 2 times pi. I know my circumference is my waist length plus cut line seam allowances, which was 75 centimetres, so I'll divide that by 2 times pi, which is 6.28, and I get 11.94 centimetres, which is so close to 12, so I'm going to round it up. Now that I've got my radius, I'll find 12 centimetres on my ruler and place on the top corner and make a mark 12 centimetres long on the skirt. Then I'll keep rotating the ruler and making marks 12 centimetres away all along the skirt. And I should have a nice circle shape in the end. Okay, so that's how you mark the inner circle of your skirt, but we need to add a seam allowance so we can attach it to the waistband. To add your seam allowance, grab your ruler and place it over the line you drew and draw another line 1 centimetre or half an inch closer to the centre of your tablecloth. The seam allowance circle should be smaller. If you want to check your measurement, just measure along the curve and times it by 4, and it should equal your inner circle circumference. Now just cut along your seam allowance, and I'm putting some pins in first just to stabilise the fabric, and you'll have the inner circle of your skirt. Before you unfold your skirt, put some marks along one of the edges. This is where we'll cut along to create our seams or cut line. Having the seam on grain will make it much easier to sew, and it'll look nicer when it's finished too. Don't cut the skirt yet though, otherwise you might cut through 2 layers. So once you've made your marks, unfold the skirt and then cut along it. So that's our skirt pattern. We've removed the inner circle and cut our cut line. Now all we need to do is make a waistband. The waistband for the skirt is just a rectangle. The length is your inner circle circumference because this is where it will be sewn. For the waistband width, I usually do somewhere between 3 and 4 centimetres, so 1 1/4 inches to 1 1/2 inches. The classic measurement that you'll see in books is 3 centimetres, so 1 1/4 inches. But I find this looks a bit small, and I like a bigger waistband, so I'm going to do 4 centimetres, but it's completely up to you. You do what you want. You can have a seam along the top of the waistband, but the easiest thing to do is just double the width and put it on the fold when you're sewing. So whatever width you want to do for the final waistband, just double it when you create your pattern. So my width will be 8 centimetres. And draw a line along the centre and write fold line next to it. Then just add your seam allowances. They should be the same as the piece you're attaching it to. So my skirt has a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so I'll add 1 centimetre all the way around my waistband pattern. And make sure you notch all the corners and put a notch to the end of the fold line too. And then label your pattern waistband with cutting instructions, cut 1 contrast plus fuse. Contrast just means a different fabric from your main fabric, which is called self. Oh, and don't forget to draw a grain line along the pattern piece. So this pattern is correct, and it's the pattern that I would send for production or create a commercial sample. However, this is a sewing tutorial designed for beginners and people like me who aren't professional seamstresses. So I'm going to share a little pattern making hack to make stitching in the ditch, which we're going to do later with our waistband, so much easier. And if you don't know what stitch in the ditch is, I'm going to tell you in a second, and also show you how to lengthen your pattern to make it so much easier. But if you feel really comfortable stitching in the ditch, skip this section and head to the next chapter. Stitch in the ditch is a sewing technique used to attach parts of the garment in place, like a waistband, and you do this by sewing along a seam that you've already sewn. Well, the idea is this stitching shouldn't be visible, so you need to stitch right in the seam that you've already sewn. So you put the seam that you've sewn to the right side of the fabric on top, so you can make sure that stitch is really straight and it's right next to the seam. And when you're doing that, the piece that you're trying to attach is actually underneath, and it's really easy for it to move. And if it moves, you might not catch it, so it means the piece you're trying to attach might slip up and you won't be able to catch the whole thing. There are a bunch of things you can do to make stitching in the ditch easier, like really carefully and accurately pressing the seam allowance of your piece first with an iron. You can also use lots of vertical pins to pin it in place. You can also sew a basting stitch, which is a really large temporary stitch used to hold something in place while you sew the final stitch. You can also feel the seams as you go to make sure they're in the right place, and you could use a walking foot on your machine instead of a zipper foot. While these tips are great, and I will do some of them, they aren't enough. I want to make this as easy as possible for me to make my skirt, and I feel like the pattern is setting me up to fail. Take a look at this. This is a diagram of my waistband pattern sewn into my circle skirt. And you can see I've already pressed the 1 cm seam allowance up on the waistband pattern. And this is where the stitch in the ditch stitching will be. It's right next to the seam on the skirt side, and the idea is if I fold the other side of the waistband down, it will catch the fabric with the stitching. But if both sides of my waistband pattern are the same width, how would I catch it? The other side would finish at the seam too, not below it. And that's why stitching in the ditch is so hard. The pattern is really designed to make you fail. If you're an experienced seamstress, you'll be fine, so keep the pattern as it is. But home sewers, join me and let's add an extra 0.5 centimetre, so a 1/4 inch, to our patterns on the one side, just to extend it a bit. Yes, you will have a little flap on the edge, on the inside of the waistband, but no one's going to see it. And to be honest, unless you're a really experienced seamstress, you'll have that flap anyway, because that's what happens with stitching in a ditch. And the important thing is in the end really that you catch the waistband. This will make it so much easier. And that's the waistband pattern. So you need to buy or find a fabric to cut it in. So you could find a fabric that matches really well with your skirt, or just something completely different, a completely different colour. Whichever fabric you choose, make sure you block fuse it first to give it extra strength. So iron a medium weight fusing to the wrong side of the fabric, and make sure the fusing grain and fabric grain are going in the same direction. Then pin your waistband pattern to the fused fabric. The fusing will give it extra strength, and it's much easier to block fuse the fabric first and then cut it. My fabric has quite a large yarn, so I can see it really well, so I'm just getting my ruler and putting it along the weft yarn and then lining up my pattern, so I'm making sure it's on grain. Then cut your pattern. Before I attach the waistband to the skirt, I'll head over to the iron and fold my waistline along the fold line, using the notches at each end as a guide. When you fold the fabric, the right side of the fabric should be visible, so you shouldn't be able to see any fusing. This is really easy to do if your fold line is in the centre, but because one side's a bit longer, I've just pinned my waistband along the fold line so I know it's right. Then I'm pressing the fold line, creating a nice sharp line. I'm also going to press the seam allowance along one length of the waistband. If you made one side of your waistband pattern longer, to make the stitching in the ditch easier, press that side seam allowance up. And I'm using a ruler not to measure how big the seam allowance is, but I'm making sure the waistband is the right width. There will always be cutting errors, and the important thing is the waistband is the right width, not that you have a perfect 1 cm seam allowance folded. Before I attach the waistband, I need to finish the seam allowance along the cut line, so where the zip will be inserted. I unpick the hem first, so I can access the full seam. I also put a tiny bit of fusing along the top here, where the zip will be attached. This will give it extra strength. Make sure you only put fusing in the seam allowance though. Then, I overlock the edge. After I finish sewing the seam, I'll stitch the hem back together again. If I didn't unpick it, the overlocking would have gone over the hem edge there, and it would have been visible, which would not look good. Assuming you have access to an overlocker, overlocking is the easiest way to finish your seam. You could also bind it, and once you're done with that, we can start attaching our waistband. Grab your skirt pattern and pin the length of the waistband that you didn't press the seam allowance on to the inner circle of the skirt. When you're pinning the seam allowance, you should be able to see the wrong side of your waistband fabric, so the fusing should be visible, and the wrong side of your skirt fabric. Once you finish pinning, you can sew along the seam. If you're new to sewing, you'll quickly realise that ironing or pressing is actually half of what sewing is. So make sure you set up your iron and ironing board when you set up your sewing machine. And you should always press the seam open or closed after you finish sewing it. It'll just make your garment look a lot better. But you can also press your pattern piece to make it easier to sew. This seam will be concealed inside the waistband, so let's press it up towards the waistband. While it might seem like a good idea to sort of iron with the seam on top so you can see it and see what you're doing, it's so easy for the fabric underneath to crumple, especially on a circular skirt where it's really curved. So it's best to flip the fabric over so you can see the seam and push upwards, and just feel to make sure the seam allowance is in place. So flip the skirt over so the right side of the waistband is visible, and before you press, just feel the seam is facing up towards the waistband and then press it. As you go, help push the fabric up with your fingers so the seam is pressed flat. Always check the fabric is flat nearby too. It's so easy to accidentally have the fabric crumpled and then put your iron down and squash it accidentally. Before we close the waistband, we need to insert our zipper. I'm going to use an invisible zipper and start it at the top of the waistband. I've already finished my seam. I've got fusing along the edge here. Before I insert the zip, I want to sew the rest of the seam below it. And to do that, I need to mark where the zipper will end. I'll position the zip so the plastic bit is right on the fold line of the waistband and pin it in place. I'm just working out the end of my zip, so I'm not pinning it to sew it, so don't worry about pinning it exactly in place. And I'm just going to mark the position of the waistband seam on either side of the zipper tape and make sure these points are the same. This will help me sew the zipper straight so it doesn't go in an angle, and make sure the seams match up when you sew the zip. Now I need to mark the end of my zip. The zip should finish about 3 centimeters, so 1 1/4 inches above the bottom stopper here. But it could be 5 centimeters, so 2 inches if you want to shorten your zip a bit. I'm using a 20 centimeter zip, which means it will be about 17 centimeters long when it's sewn. Double check that you've marked the same point on both sides of the fabric and the zipper tape. Now that I've got my end point, I'll pin the seams together below. I'm just double checking my waist seam is lining up. And I'm going to check that my print matches up by putting vertical pins at the key points too. Once I've finished pinning my print placement, I'll then pin the rest of the seam. Then I'll just sew along it. Once I've sewn the seam, I'll close the hem, which I had to open to overlock my edge. Then I'll press the seam open and press the seam allowance above where the zip will be inserted. This will make it easier to insert my zip accurately. Now let's pin our zip to sew it. The plastic bit should be at the top here, so where the folded edge is of the waistband. Now the edge may look like it's here, but you can actually open it up a bit, so really roll it out, push the teeth out, otherwise you'll see part of the zip. Then pin the zip so the crease here is on the seam allowance edge that you've pressed open. Make sure the waistband seam mark you've made is aligned with the seam too. If you've got any stripes or prints, you can mark other points along the zip tag too, so they match perfectly. I'm going to try and mark this one here, although because it's a circle, I don't think I'll be able to do it, but I'll give it a go. Then I'll mark matching points on the other side of my zipper tape, and then pin the other side to my skirt. If you're new to sewing and not feeling very confident about sewing with an invisible zip, get an invisible zipper foot, but you can also get a second zip and just practice on some spare fabric. Just give it a go. It's a lot less scary than it looks. You could also do what is called a basting stitch along the zipper tape here first. A basting stitch is just a temporary stitch used to hold layers of fabric together when you're sewing to prevent it from moving around. The stitch length is usually longer, so it's easy to remove, but you can keep the basting stitch on the zipper tape. It'll actually help secure the tape more to the fabric. I've already switched my machine's foot, so now I've got a regular zipper foot on. This will allow you to get close to the zipper. And I'm going to do a basting stitch somewhere along the tape on both sides. Once I'm done, I'll check my waistband seam matches and the zip is looking good. Now I'm going to do the proper stitch right next to the zipper, and I'm going to switch to my invisible zipper foot. You can use a regular zipper foot, but rather than putting the foot on top of the zipper teeth, you'll put it right next to it. If you're using a normal zipper foot, roll the zipper teeth out as you go so you can get right in the valley there. And make sure you backstitch all your seams at the beginning and the end, so just reverse back a couple of stitches and then go forward again so it doesn't unravel. And the zipper shouldn't be attached below the finish mark here. Then do the other side. Once you're done, carefully pull the slider and the pull tab above the zip finishing line. And moment of truth, yes, the seams match up. Now I'll just press my fabric away from the zip. This will give it a really nice finish and stop it from getting caught in the zip. I'm just pulling the fabric slightly as I go. Now the zip is in, we can finish the waistband. This is just a little sewing hack. I'm going to trim my waistband at the edge here by 0.4 centimeters, so 1/8 of an inch at the base to 0 at the fold line. This will help pull the fabric away from the zip on the inside of my waistband. And I'll do that on both sides. The seam allowance is still 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch though. Now with the right side of the skirt fabric facing me, I'll pull the zip extension down at an angle so it's sandwiched between the zipper tape and the waistband seam allowance. Then I'll fold the other side of the waistband on top so the right sides are inside and you can see the fusing on the waistband on top. Then I'll pull the waistband fabric to the edge. Make sure the seam allowance along the edge of the waistband, which you've already ironed up, is folded up too. Then, using a zipper foot, you can then stitch along the width of the waistband. It's best to do a basting stitch along the tape first, then do a second row of stitching next to zipper stitching, so it's just inside the seam allowance. So you should have 2 rows of stitching, one basting one, and then one very close to where the zipper has been sewn to the waistband. And once you're done, you can trim the seam allowance at the corner here to reduce the bulk and help you get a really sharp corner. Repeat these same steps on the other side of the waistband, then flip the waistband right side out and press the seam. If it feels bulky, you can trim the seam allowance some more. See how the fabric is pulling away a bit on the back? This is because we did that little sewing hack where we trim the edge. This is what you want. You want the fabric on the back here to be a little bit away from the zipper so it won't get stuck. Now it's time to stitch in the ditch, and you need to grab a zipper foot, so a regular zipper foot, so you can get right in the seam there. Feel free to do a basting stitch or use a lot of vertical pins. I'm feeling pretty confident though because I altered my pattern, so I'm just going to insert a couple of vertical pins, but my chosen tactic is to go really slowly and make sure I can feel the folded edge underneath. The seam bulk should feel consistent, so if it starts to feel thinner, it means your fabric has slipped. And while I'm sewing, I'm also pulling the waistband and skirt fabric out as I go, so away from each other. The idea is you get almost on top of the seam. When the fabric is released and seen normally, it will help to cover the seam you just sewed. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and the end to secure your stitch too, and slip the threads at each end, and you're done. I think it's looking pretty good. And that's how you turn a tablecloth into a beautiful circle skirt. And honestly, getting started was the hardest part. I haven't made anything in a while, which might surprise you because I'm a pattern cutter, but I've kind of been putting this video off, but it felt so good to actually make something again. I love this skirt so much, turned out so well, and it was a really fun project to make. So I've started looking for other fabric sources to make more of them in. You go to a market or an op shop or a vintage store, I think it would look really great in a lace or embroidered tablecloth. So start looking. It was a really fun project and so easy to make. Then you'll need to get about 20 centimeters of fabric and 20 centimeters of medium weight fuse for the waistband, and a 20 centimeter long invisible zip. Try to find a zip that matches your color of your tablecloth. If your widest point, which is usually around the crotch, is a fair bit bigger than your hip, you might want to get a 25 centimeter, so 10-inch zip. It's almost summer here in Australia as well, so I also thought that circular beach towels would make really good circle skirts. I didn't have much luck finding any lightweight cotton round beach towels online, but Pillow Talk has a great range of linen tablecloths with trims along the edge, and they're a pretty good price too. No idea how to pronounce the next one, but Rupantaran has some great Indian block printed tablecloths. You could also check out Kip & Co. It's a bit more expensive, but they're an Aussie-based brand with sustainable ethos and have lots of fun prints. Then there's always Etsy. I found so many beautiful tablecloths, including some amazing Shibori and Indonesian batik ones. And I've put all these links in the description. And that's it. You watched the video, you know what to do, so now go buy your fabric and make a beautiful circle skirt. And having said all of that, this is not how I'd make a circle skirt pattern from scratch. In fact, I wouldn't do any of that except for the waistband pattern and taking the waist measurement. It would be completely different. Watch this next video to learn how to draft any flared skirt pattern using a more intuitive design-based approach and a lot less maths than other circle skirt videos.